Okay, so tonight, this talk is part of the stream that I'm doing off the back of my upcoming book, which is called Cult Cinema, which is about brainwashing bad religion in movies. And this particular one is about one particular corner of the sort of sideways religion thing that needs to be addressed when you're looking at religion, particularly religion that is in some way problematic, and that is the sects. And the difference between a cult and a sect and a full-on religion is wobbly. It's inchoate. It has lots of different opinions, but the definition I'm working from here is that a sect is a group that is part of a major religion, but divergent and separate from it, and which considers itself to be the real part of that religion, as opposed to the other, the main body of it, and which may diverge from orthodoxy, but which still is part of the religion. And being who I am, I'm going to, and knowing what I know and speaking to what I know about, I'm going to concentrate on the Western sects that draw from Protestant Christianity. There are sects from other world religions. For example, you could call the Baha'i a sect of Islam, or Sufis a sect of Islam. But I don't really know enough, and I'm probably wrong there. I don't know. So I'm much more comfortable talking about the Protestant Christian sects. And they are visible. We know about them. They exist in our everyday lives, and we have a kind of weird relationship with them. And I mean, in my area, and about 5 minutes walk from where I live, there was an area of empty ground, which in 2006, a whole bunch of entirely average-looking people, an entire bunch of entirely average-looking people converged and built the Upland Swansea Kingdom Hall, which is, this is what it looks like now. And this is 5 minutes walk from my house, and it was built by people who were ordinary members of the Jehovah's Witness, as part of their religious practice. And Jehovah's Witnesses, as you probably know, are a group of people who include among their religious practices evangelism, specifically the evangelism where they try to get you to read their literature. They try to give you the literature, and traditionally that was seen as knocking on doors. And over the last few years, they've had a rebrand, and there's clearly been a change of leadership in the Jehovah's Witness movement, because like their literature's gotten a lot more slick. It's improved a lot. It used to look incredibly retro and cheesy, and now it's actually starting to look a little bit more professional. But also, you see jw.org, and they have like a logo, and you see them nowadays standing in the street in busy thoroughfares. And because there's a Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall not far from me, they are always around where I live, standing by a stand full of free literature, and not stopping people or anything, just standing there. And I've got to be honest, I'm the sort of person who collects this stuff anyway, so I quite often wander over to the Jehovah's Witness literature stand and give them a smile and take something. The Jehovah's Witnesses are not the only Protestant sects, and the thing that all the Protestant sects hold in common, though, or at least the ones that matter, is that they're what we call restorationist. Now, restorationism, and this is kind of important because this is the context in which they exist. So restorationism, right, and this is a dictionary definition, is either the doctrine that all people will ultimately be restored to a state of happiness in the future life, and/or a charismatic movement seeking to restore the beliefs and practices of the early church and the doctrines and principles of this movement. That is, the restorationist groups. And to be fair, this includes mainline Protestants as well and evangelical Christians as well. Consider that they are going past the tradition and history of 2,000 years of church and trying to recreate a New Testament church. Charismatic evangelical Christians, the sort of signs and wonders or spiritual warfare Christians, or if you want to be a little bit more dismissive or perhaps more obvious, the happy clappy ones, consider their Christianity to be New Testament Christianity. And restorationists of whatever stripe want to be New Testament Christians. They want to ignore the tradition of Catholicism and Anglicanism and all those histories of the church and come back to the point where they're being a New Testament church. And there's a lot of reasons why that's impossible. But the restorationist sects, okay, include the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormons, which may surprise you, but it's true, they think they're restorationist. The Brethren, the Plymouth Brethren, and the exclusive Brethren, okay, Seventh-day Adventists, and Christadelphians. And Christadelphians are kind of an obscure, tiny one. They have a presence in Swansea, where I live, which is kind of weird. But they're an odd sort, the Christadelphians. Anyway, there are others as well, and a lot of these have in common that they're all restorationists. They all come from the 19th century as well, and they weren't the only sects that arose in the 19th century. And there's lots of reasons why these sects arose in the 19th century. And partly it's because of the first flowering of atheism as a thing, fueled by science. It's because the world changed and became industrial, and the way in which people responded to that happened. And so people went off and formed sects and cults and religious groups. And it's the 19th century is the biggest flowering of discrete religious groups in history, pretty much. Religious groups just became incredibly fissile around that time. So these are all 19th century groups. And some of them are some of them are more what you would consider orthodox than others. So the Brethren, for instance, and the Seventh-day Adventists are people who have on occasion worked alongside mainline evangelicals and have standard Christian theology, as opposed to the Jehovah's Witnesses, who have non-standard takes on central parts of Christian doctrine, and the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, which has a whole third testament in the Bible. Seventh-day Adventists, and actually, Billy Graham allowed Seventh-day Adventists to come on his crusades. Christadelphians, on the other hand, are basically like groups who, they're basically like really, really serious Protestants with everything that is fun removed from their religion. They are the least fun religion I have ever come across. They don't even have kitsch. It's all tasteful. It's ghastly. And I mean, you see leaflets. I mean, just, around here, we've got a university which has a lot of international students, and we have a Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall, which is the biggest for quite some area. So we see this stuff. So Jehovah's Witness literature, as I said, it's a lot less cheesy than it used to look. I mean, it's still pretty cheesy, but it doesn't have like kitschy 1950s style paintings of little children hugging lions with Jesus looking on and stuff like that, which I remember happening. I wish I still had those. But you can see they're trying to be contemporary. They're trying to be there. So you got Awake, which is the Jehovah's Witness official magazine. You've got Answers to 10 Questions Young People Ask, which include questions like, Who am I? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What are my goals? What are my convictions? Why do I worry about my appearance? How can I talk to my parents? How can I fix my mistakes? What if I'm being bullied at school? How can I resist peer pressure? How can I deal with the pressure to have sex? What should I know about sexual assault? And should I believe in evolution? So yeah, and the last one is, how can the Bible help me? Because of course it is. Was life created is basically a creationist tract. But also you get nicely dressed young men, often American, who turn up very clean cut and hand you things like this. And this is a bit more cheesy and a bit more old school. This is, and it's got some unintentionally hilarious illustrations in it. And this is from the Church of the Latter-day Saints. This is from those dear old Mormons, and and they always look like they're about 12 years old, and yet they have badges that say elder. So these groups exist, and these groups exist in different. So I'm going to focus on 3 groups in this talk, and partly because these are the groups that have films with characters in them that are members of these groups, which I looked that there is a film about growing up Seventh-day Adventist called The Nostradamus Kid, which was made in 1993. But can I find a copy of it? No, I cannot. So when I do find a copy of it, I will be writing about it. But as it stands, I'm going to concentrate on 3 groups. And the first of these groups, I'm going to concentrate on a group called the Plymouth Brethren. Now, okay, so the Plymouth Brethren, and let's go into who they are. So the Plymouth Brethren and the Exclusive Brethren, who are a split of the Plymouth Brethren, they're actually from Ireland in the 1820s. They started in Dublin, in fact, and they had meetings and Bible meetings and stuff like that. And the reason they're called the Plymouth Brethren was because they grew, and they had a meeting in Plymouth, where my mum and my brother live even now, in 1831, and they got loads of members from Plymouth. I don't know why. And they got over 1,000 members, which in the 19th century was no mean feat. Now it's phenomenal, by the way. If you have, I looked at the numbers of churches in the UK, and it turns out that if you have over 1,000 members in your church, you are going to be one of the 20 biggest churches in the country, which is, quite mind-blowing, actually, think about it, given this is supposed to be. Right, and their beliefs. They are Trinitarian Christians. They believe, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and all that sort of thing. But they are sola scriptura. That literally means they use the Bible and nothing else as the guide to how they live their lives, as opposed to Catholics who have scripture, tradition, and the other thing. And I'm sorry. And the threefold order of the church and all that sort of thing. They just got the Bible. They're primitivists. They're this sort of old school. They want to be New Testament Christians. It's a restorationist kind of thing. The dispensationalist, they kind of believe that something's going to happen, and that miraculous things happen from time to time. The Plymouth Brethren also, incidentally, came up with the idea of the rapture, which is hugely popular among American evangelical Christians, and is the foundation of the Left Behind novels. They have hardline rules about association with society. Traditionally, Plymouth Brethren are not supposed to watch TV. They're supposed to dress in a very, very serious and sober way. They don't eat meals with people who are not Plymouth Brethren. They're very much separate. And so one of their founders, John Nelson Darby, famously said that those who like society better have it. Which, kind of, you think about it, kind of mind-blowing. It's basically an entire organization that's built on misanthropy. if you think about it. Right. So as a group, you know, and you've got John Nelson Darby's one of the founders, one of the other founders, and the only reason that I'm including this guy is because he's got an amazing name, George Vicesimus Wigram. And these guys basically started out the Plymouth Brethren as a group, and they made it super severe, divided from the world, all these things, right? So I've only found one movie which is significant, which looks at the Plymouth Brethren and treats the Plymouth Brethren as a central point. And this movie is not one that you might immediately assume to be about this. The movie I'm talking about is the 2007 British film, Son of Rambo. In Son of Rambo, you have these two boys, Will, who's the one on the right, and he's played by Bill Milner, and the one on the left is Lee, who's played by Will Poulter, who of course is actually a fairly well-known actor and still working now as an adult. Was most recently seen famously in Black Mirror Bandersnatch and in Midsummer. Will is a boy who is from a Plymouth Brethren family. His father died tragically young. He's brought up by his mother, who's played by Jessica Hines, who then was Jessica Stevenson. And Will becomes friends at school with a kid who has his own family problems, Lee, and Lee is basically left to be a tearaway because his mother was his mother's cleared off, and so he's got his brother in parental in parentis, and he's sort of doing his thing. Anyway, they become unlikely friends, and they work together, and blood brothers, in fact, and they work together to make a movie. And Will's never seen a movie before, so the first movie he ever sees is First Bloods, and it just fires off all sorts of quirky imaginings in it because he's got this unfiltered imagination, because he's never had any contact with media, and creates something mind-blowing. And Lee sees this, and the two of them work together to make this movie. There's this very telling scene where you see his Bible, and his Bible is essentially every page of the Bible has drawn on it all sorts of incredible doodles and things. The film sometimes goes into like flights of imagination and stuff, but this creates conflict with Will's family, who are Plymouth Brethren. You sort of see the Plymouth Brethren meetings, and this is wonderful seeing the meeting. You see all the wristwatches on the table at the back of the meeting, because you're supposed to be paying attention, and you're not allowed to be looking at your watch. And you see an elder of the church who tries to take Will in hand, because he's got designs on Will's widowed mother, and you see the mother's wearing very sensible clothes and a headscarf and everything. And the conflict is basically about him being taken in hand, because he shouldn't be making this movie. He shouldn't be hanging out with a tearaway. He shouldn't be having fun. There's a heartbreaking scene where, it's set in the early 80s, so there's this heartbreaking scene where his mother talks about how she got herself a record player in order to play this single that she'd heard. And she bought the single, and she wanted to play it to her parents, and her parents broke the record and burnt the record player. And she sort of tells it to Will as if that's like them protecting her. And you sort of see that she actually knows that's destructive and abusive, and that they did everything they could to reduce her horizons. At the end of the film, Will's friendship with Lee and the making of the film, and it's a lovely, charming movie. I watched it again with my 11-year-old son yesterday, actually, and we had a great time watching it. It's just so it's just an adorable film. It allows her, the friendship, the making of the film, allows her to break free from the control of this horrible man, and from the miserable, joyless existence of the church. But you see, what the film doesn't have is any sort of like idea as to why you might be a Plymouth Brethren in the first place, or why you might remain in the Plymouth Brethren in the first place. It just shows the Plymouth Brethren as an entirely joyless and miserable experience. Now, the most significant and powerful, actually, and the one with the most media reach of all the post-Protestant sects is the Church of the Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons. And there's a reason why they're powerful. They're powerful because they pretty much founded one of the states of the USA, and they were there in order to get in there and be part of the whole settling movement in the USA. And because of Joseph Smith, and when Joseph Smith was 24 years old, he had a revelation. He was visited by the angel Moroni, and it was vouchsafed to him that he would write the Book of Mormon. And here's my dad's copy of the Book of Mormon, which I inherited. And the Book of Mormon apparently is actually 2,500 years old, but foretells the history of the Church of the United States. It just only happened to be written down in the 1820s. The thing that most gets me about the Book of Mormon is that it feels like self-insert fan fiction. Entire chunks of it include sort of like this sort of weird kind of fantasy biblical world with characters with names that read like a 19th century American might have made up in order to sound like biblical characters. So there's Helaman, and there's Mosiah, and there's Alma, and there's Nephi, who is a big deal. And yeah, the prophet Joseph Smith, here he is. He translated the ancient writings inscribed on gold plates, from which the first edition of the Book of Mormon was published in 1830. And he got the gold plates on a hill near Manchester, New York. And in 1935, the Mormons put a monument there. And yeah, I mean, and the copy of the Book of Mormon I've got is full of like old school, amazing fantasy biblical art with characters who aren't really Bible characters, and the writing is like written by someone who is emulating the King James Bible without really quite getting there. Now, Joseph Smith actually died tragically young. He died at the age of 39, and he died at the age of 39 because he was the mayor of a town called Norvo, and in Illinois, and he was basically a tyrannical mayor, and he didn't like what the newspapers were saying about him, so he shut down the newspaper, and that caused a riot, and he wound up getting killed in the violence, which is wild. But his religion was taken over by a prominent follower of his, Brigham Young. And what Brigham Young did, he set himself up, and later on was called the American Moses. And Brigham Young had big old wagon trains, and they went to the west, and they founded the state of Utah by the Great Salt Lake, and Salt Lake City was founded, and they were given the right of statehood by the American president Millard Fillmore, who was an interesting guy. He was only president for 3 years. He was president for 3 years in dead man's shoes, because he was the vice president of a guy who got sick and died, and he took over for 3 years. And he was until 2016 regarded by historians as the worst president the United States ever had. But as I said, in 2016 that changed. I think why. Now, one film that looks at the early Mormon church is the movie September Dawn, which was made in 2007. And you've not heard of September Dawn because it was a colossal flop. And the reason it's a colossal flop is because it is unbelievably terrible. It is a bad movie. It is badly written. It is badly paced. It is badly edited. It is badly directed. It is badly acted. And it's about the Meadowmound Massacre, or no, not the Meadowmound Massacre, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, sorry. And the Mountain Meadows Massacre happened on September the 11th, 1857. So September Dawn was made to coincide with the 150th anniversary. And what happened at the Mountain Meadows Massacre was a bunch of devout Christian settlers were passing through, and they asked the Mormons in the area of Utah that were passing through if they could be allowed to camp and buy grain and provisions, and then they'll move on and be on their way. And the Mormons said, yes, you can camp here and buy the provisions, and then organized a bunch of men and killed a lot of them. Yeah, this is and you know, this is a thing that happens. The Church of the Latter-day Saints, in fact, not only admit that it happened, but actually set up a monument saying this is a bad thing that we did, and we're never going to forget that, and we'll carry the guilt of it forever. And but the film itself sets these settlers as being devout and lovely, perfect Christians, and the Mormons as absolute villains, like utter terrorist fundamentalist types. And there's this scene towards the beginning where the Mormons have said, you can come sit on our land, and you have like their little minister, and he prays this lovely prayer about thanking them for the kindness of the people who live there. And then what's happened is that intercut with a scene where the bishop, Jacob Samuelson, who's played by John Voight of all people, so Angela Jolie's dad, is praying at the same time, thank you for delivering these Gentiles into our hands and demonstrating to us that they're cursed, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to wipe their scourge off the earth. And yeah, they're just black-hearted villains. And the film introduces a fictional kind of subplot where his son falls in love with one of the settler women, which doesn't make any sense anyway. It's kind of a Romeo and Juliet thing happening. But one of the things the film does, and which made it controversial among Latter-day Saint circles, was that it has Brigham Young, who's here played by Terence Stamp, who's not so much phoning in his performances, emailing it, and emailing it as a copied and pasted forward. He plays Brigham Young, and the film suggests that Brigham Young knew about the massacre and gave it his blessing. And there is no evidence that Brigham Young, who did a lot of terrible things, let me tell you, there's no evidence that he did that. And the Church of Latter-day Saints is quite solid on the opinion that, you know, Brigham Young might have done a bunch of stuff, but he did not make the Mountain Meadows Massacre happen. It's But it's basically like, we're making a film about Mormons. We're just going to talk about how terrible they are. We're going to talk about how evil they are. We're going to talk about how they're basically wild, nasty fundamentalists who murder nice, well-meaning Christians. It's a film that doesn't have any kind of empathy for its subject. And again, it doesn't give you any idea why anyone might actually want to be in the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Now, one of the things about the Church of Latter-day Saints is that there are people who are Mormons in the entertainment industry. So, for example, there's the American rock band Low, who are Latter-day Saints, and there are some people who work in film. Mitt Romney, the politician, has tried to run for president on a number of occasions. He is a Mormon. And also, you've got film directors, and one prominent film director, semi-prominent film director, who is important to look at this point, is Jared Hess, who, with his wife and scriptwriter Jerusha, have done a series of films which look at his first 4 movies all deal with religion, or living in a religion, although it's kind of difficult to see in the first one particularly. Jared and Jerusha Hess's first film was hugely popular and very well known and hugely misinterpreted because it's Napoleon Dynamite. And the thing about Napoleon Dynamite is that it's set in Utah, okay? And everybody who saw Napoleon Dynamite thought, this is just the most hilarious, quirky comedy full of losers and ne'er-do-wells and weirdos. And in fact, it was based on people who Jared and Jerusha Hess knew. It's actually an affectionate look at people who are growing up Mormon. And they're not growing up Mormon in the sense of practicing the religion. They're growing up culturally Mormon. That they're living in a Mormon part of the world. So it's like that's the same sense. And what's interesting about it is that same sense of homemade imagination that comes from the way in which the Mormon imagination has been developed over 150 years. The fact, you've got a religion that's founded in fan fiction. Fan fiction and homemade stuff becomes a thing. And Napoleon Dynamite is, it's a sweet film about how everybody gets one day where they get to win. Okay. And it's interesting in that respect. But, okay, the second film Jared and Jerusha Hess made was Nacho Libre, which is about a Catholic. Jack Black as a Catholic monk who takes up wrestling, but in Mexico. But their third film is the most Mormon film ever made. This film is Gentlemen Broncos. Now, Gentlemen Broncos was slammed when it came out. It was regarded as bully porn by at least one, I think it was 18 Cool News called it bully porn. They're basically like, it's full of freaks and weirdos. There are no freaks and weirdos in Gentlemen Broncos. In fact, actually, I showed this film to a friend who had lived for some years in Utah. And she sat there with me and she watched it with me. And she said, every person in this film is a Mormon. Everyone in this movie is a Mormon. And it's really interesting to see how Mormon this film is in its assumptions, in its lifestyle, and everything. The film was about Benjamin Purvis. And Benjamin Purvis, played by Michael Angarano here, is a teenage boy who writes science fiction. And he's softly spoken, he cares for his mother, and he reveres his late father, who was a park warden and who died. And he clearly, utterly mourns for his dad. He's got a little shrine to him set up in his bedroom and everything. And his science fiction books, which are shown in sort of little inset scenes starring Sam Rockwell, feature a guy called Bronco, who's clearly based upon Benjamin's dad. But Benjamin's mum is worried about Benjamin because he doesn't go out much, and so she gets a guy from church to do a kind of guardian angel kind of thing. And this guy's called Dusty, played by Mike White here. And Dusty has a snake. And I've got to say, Gentlemen Broncos is a movie I really like, but at the same time, you do actually have to have a tolerance for jokes about snake shit. Just saying. Now, and Benjamin's mum works in a shop that sells modest underwear, which is clearly Mormon underwear. And if you actually do a Google search for modest lingerie or modest nightwear, you will find entire areas of modest Mormon clothing. There is a thing. This is a thing, very much so. And modest nightwear is sort of a subplot in the film. We see them in church. They're never actually called Mormons at any point, but they're clearly living in Utah. They're clearly doing stuff. Benjamin goes to a writer's camp, and he meets a couple of people. He meets Lonnie and he meets Tabitha, and here's Tabitha. And Tabitha's just bought a whole bunch of snacks on the stop on the way. Benjamin gave her all his money because she said she needed to buy some sanitary products, and she went and bought snacks and then ate them all in front of him and with her friend Lonnie. And she basically conned him, and she spends a lot of the film conning Benjamin out of stuff, and she does so by the simple fact that she has things in common with him. She's into writing as well. She's part of the same Mormon homeschooling co-op, and it's interesting because what she's actually doing is what's called affinity fraud, where essentially you bilk someone out of money or resources by saying what you have in common with them. And the biggest affinity fraud in history is actually the pyramid scheme that Bernie Madoff perpetrated in 2000 until 2008. And he was Jewish and he lived in New York, and he managed to perpetuate a pyramid scheme, and he bankrupted a Holocaust charity and that sort of thing. But that was the biggest affinity fraud in history. And it was one of the causes of the 2008 financial crash, because Bernie Madoff was the chairman of the FDA. But Utah is the national capital in the USA for affinity fraud. Mormons are really easy marks. And one of the reasons that Mormons are really easy marks is that most people operate on a level where they assume that everyone is as ethically sound as they are. And on one level, that means that you have racists who racists assume that everybody else is sort of a bit racist, and that if you're not racist, you're actually just pretending, which is where the term virtue signaling comes from. But at the same time, if you're actually honest and honorable, and Mormonism teaches people to be straight down the line honorable, then you assume everybody else is honest. So if someone gives you a hard luck story, you'll fall for it, and you fall for it all the time. Another interesting thing in the thing, as he goes to this writer's camp, and there's a writing competition, and it's judged by a science fiction writer called Professor Ronald Chevalier, who's played by Jermaine Clement, and is one of the most hilarious things in this film. And Dr. Chevalier judges the competition, but he himself is actually kind of out of ideas, and he can't think of anything, and he reads Benjamin's novel, and he nicks it. He changes the names and changes some of the details and steals it wholesale, and then wins an award for it. And he's also a Mormon. Specifically, he's one specific Mormon because he is basically a fictionalized version of the science fiction writer Orson Scott Card. Now, Orson Scott Card is known for writing juvenile science fiction, particularly, especially Ender's Game, which is his most famous novel. He is known for judging children's writing competitions and for being, the guest of honor at children's writing camps. He had an accusation of being a plagiarist. Oh, he's a massive bigot as well, like massive homophobe and everything, because he's quite conservative. But yeah, I mean, Ronald Chevalier is Orson Scott Card. He is the most Mormon of science fiction writers, and Mormons do science fiction. The other thing that happens in the film is that Tabitha and her friend Lonnie try to make a movie of Benjamin's book, and they just make a terrible, terrible hash of it. And again, you see that homemade thing. But also Lonnie is very camp, and there is a big thing about young Mormon men being very camp. Also, a lot of Hispanic Mormons, because Lonnie is Hispanic, played by Hector Jimenez. And you see these things all there, this whole kind of world where everything is based upon an imagination that is not mainstream, because it is essentially directed by growing up in a specific, unusual religion. So it's not really bully porn. You have Benjamin, who wins through, not by being a milquetoast, but by being an obedient and respectful son who is honest and straightforward. You have affinity fraud. You have Orson Scott Carding it. You have a mum who really, really cares about her son. The wonderful twist at the end could be a Deus Ex Machina, except it makes perfect sense if you know she's a Mormon, because his mum saves the day. She comes out of nowhere and saves the day. But it makes perfect sense if you know she's a Mormon, because what she does to save the day is a very Mormon thing to do. And essentially what she does is that she's essentially been registering the copyright of everything he's ever written since he was 12 years old, which means that he's able to send a cease and desist to Ronald Chevalier and get his book being the popular one. But yeah, Mormons do science fiction, and science fiction, I think, is because Mormonism has a sense of journey. I mean, as far as the fact that it is essentially written in what amounts to, it's essentially a religion based upon what amounts to Bible fan fiction. But, and don't get me wrong, fan fiction is actually really important and transformative, and the Book of Mormon proves that. But you sort of see that sense of journey, that sense of travel. But it is a settler religion more than anything else, and you see that particularly in the science fiction show The Expanse. And in the first season of The Expanse in 2016, and The Expanse, by the way, is the best space science fiction show on television, bar none. It is wonderful. You see a group of Mormons, future Mormons, and what they're doing is they're getting Fred Johnson of the OPA to build a giant generational starship, the LDSS Nauvoo, and in Nauvoo, the town where Joseph Smith died, and the LDSS, Latter Day Saints ship, you see. And the idea is that they're building this ship, so it's going to be a big generational ship where people will live on for hundreds of years until they arrive at Tau Ceti, where they will be able to colonize the planet. In fact, what happens is that Fred Johnson and the OPA steal the spaceship and use it as a warship. But which again, because the Mormons trust him, and he's not to be trusted. So again, affinity fraud. So yeah, you see that. Now, the Church of Latter-day Saints is a very American religion. I think actually it's the most quintessentially American religion. But another American religion which perhaps has more international reach is the Jehovah's Witness. Now, Jehovah's Witness have a way of butting up against the law quite a lot in history. So you see cases like this. This is from the British Medical Journal, and this is from last year. And this is a High Court ruling that a 14-year-old Jehovah's Witness should have blood transfusions. And is a child with lymphatic cancer, you need blood transfusions. And Jehovah's Witnesses have a hard rule against blood transfusions. But the High Court has ruled on numerous occasions. This is actually the second case in 2019 in the UK. There was one in 2014. There are older ones as well. And essentially the issue is that the law in the UK is such that if a child is in medical danger or their welfare is threatened, a professional in medicine can overrule them. And this is from the Children Act 1989, when a court determines any question with respect to the upbringing of a child or the administration of a child's property or the application of any income arising from it, the child's welfare shall be the court's paramount consideration. So these cases are about the welfare of the child, and these happen a lot. Now, there is a movie which is about one of these cases, and it's called The Children Act. And in The Children Act, Emma Thompson plays a judge who is responsible for a 17-year-old boy, judging that a 17-year-old boy who is a Jehovah's Witness, and here are his parents, should have a blood transfusion. And in the movie, you see the courtroom scene, and you see the boy, because what happens is that she's going through a marriage breakup. So she makes a lapse of judgment, and she decides that in order to help her make a decision, she should see this boy, because he's a couple of weeks off his 18th birthday. And when he turns 18, he has the right to his own autonomy, which he does not have. And he has the blood transfusion, and it saves his life, and he has a kind of crisis of faith, and he starts writing to the judge and following her around, and he wants to be, and you realize actually at the end that he has a crush on her, and she's hugely confused and everything, and she rejects him, obviously, and then he gets sick again, and he goes back to hospital, and now he's 18, and he turns down the blood transfusion and he dies. And that's essentially the arc of the film, and it's from the viewpoint of the judge, and essentially the pivotal scene about the judgment in the courtroom, you have the father basically explain, he's played by Ben Chaplin, he explains that the blood is life, and that the Bible has all these injunctions about blood. And here is the point at which groups like Jehovah's Witness butt up against society, because you have groups who separate themselves from wider society. They create a kind of conceptual brick wall around themselves, and that brick wall is made up of lines that they will not cross. And these lines that they will not cross are matters of more than life and death. They are matters of eternal life and death. They are matters of eternity. And they believe that blood is such an important gift that you cannot contaminate it with anyone else's or take anyone's blood. The blood is the life. And this goes right back to the founders of the Jehovah's Witness movement, Charles Taze Russell, whose picture I have included because it is one of the great beards of the 19th century. And then after Charles Taze Russell died, Joseph Franklin Rutherford. And the Jehovah's Witness have done a number of things. They've changed over the years. They had a change of leadership. They have said that the world is going to end and set a date for it 3 times, famously. Each of those apocalypses are described in very different terms, in all fairness. But each time they've tended to go, oh, yeah, wrong, okay. And they've done. History tells us that when a group sets a date for the end of the world, it's either falls apart and they all go home, it reschedules, or it reworks itself. It goes, oh, made a mistake, my bad. Okay, let's actually reorganize ourselves and see what we're doing and see where we're going. And what's interesting about the Jehovah's Witness is that they did the second and the third one concurrently each time. So each time they set a date for Armageddon, it didn't come. When, oh, damn, my bad. Okay, right, let's rework ourselves. Let's become a different religion. And then they set another date for Armageddon. They do it again. And they did that 3 times, and now they're not setting any more dates for Armageddon. And presumably because someone thought Armageddon's tired of this. Look, it's been a long week. But yeah, I kind of feel that they've had a lot of movement. But there are these lines they will not cross. They don't believe in the Trinity, right? And they have... they don't celebrate birthdays. They don't celebrate Christmas. They've got this weird thing where they're hung up about the fact that Jesus wasn't crucified on a cross, but on a wooden stake, as if that matters. And you sort of see that. Now there's the movie that actually goes into this in detail, rather than just picking on the blood thing, is the 2017 movie Apostasy. And in Apostasy, you have young Alex here. And Alex was actually forced under the Children Act when she was a child to have a blood transfusion, and has carried that regret for her entire life because she is a devout Jehovah's Witness. And she... she'll turn 18 over the course. She turns 18 in the course of the film. The bank sends her a birthday card, which her mother tells her to send back. You see that, and eventually, her needing a blood transfusion will be a plot point. She will bring up the cross and stake thing. Birthdays and Christmas will be mentioned. The film's made by Daniel Cocatello, who was a Jehovah's Witness. He's an ex-Jehovah's Witness. And so the film largely doesn't have anything good to say about Jehovah's Witnesses. Everybody in the movie pretty much is a Jehovah's Witness, apart from some very minor characters. It's kind of presents the Jehovah's Witnesses an organization that you really wanted to leave, which I guess, he really wanted to leave, is why he got out of it. In the movie, the mother, who's played by Siobhan Finner, and she's called Ivana, she's got a job. She works in society. She keeps herself to herself, and she's kind of very devout and very fiercely kind of committed to what they call the truth. Because if you're a Jehovah's Witnesses, you are in the truth. That's what they describe it as. And you see that it is her way of coping, and that she perpetuates misery upon her family over the film. She's a terribly tragic figure. She introduces Alex to a guy called Stephen, who's a trainee minister in the Kingdom Hall, who's played by Robert Ems there, and he's this sort of like nerdy guy. Basically asks her permission to court Alex, and they kind of like hang out together, and they kind of... it's really, really awkward and everything, and he's awkward, and he doesn't know how to deal with things, because when she ups and dies because she refuses a blood transfusion, because of course she does, he's hopeless, had it. He's got no way of dealing with grief and stuff. And the one person who really can't deal with grief is Alex's older sister, Louisa. And Louisa has a boyfriend who is not in the truth, and she gets pregnant and she gets kicked out of the Jehovah's Witnesses, which even her mum's not allowed to talk to her, and her mum struggles with that, and they try to get her back into the religion by basically sending her back into sort of meetings for indoctrination, and she can't do it. And yeah, it's just terribly tragic and terribly sad, and it's a terribly dour film. And you just find yourself, it's full of sort of scenes like this where everything is bleak, and Jehovah's Witnesses presented as the bleakest possible thing you can imagine. But if you compare that to a film that's not really about the Jehovah's Witnesses, but really about posh people's problems, the Children Act, and you see the scene where the boy's dad, Adam Henry's dad, Kevin, stands up in the dock and he basically says, when we became Jehovah's Witnesses, I stopped drinking. My relationship with my wife improved. My relationship with my son improved. We have a community of people who support us. We have all sorts of friends, a family, a network, which they didn't have when they weren't Jehovah's Witnesses before they converted. And his heart would break if his son died. But it's out of their hands. Now, people stay in these groups for a reason. And I think often films that portray Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and other sects don't get that across. It's easy to look as an outsider at these groups and to think that what they believe is silly. And six-day creation, all that sort of thing, blood transfusions being contamination. But to these people, these are the highest stakes. These things matter. These things are the most important questions in the world. And it's how they make themselves separate. I mean, and as a result, outside of these groups, it can be hard to understand why you'd want to stay. But the general point I'm trying to make here is that these groups create a kind of tension in the world. They're in the world, and they're not of the world, to quote the Apostle Paul. They are part of a group that exists. And being in the world and not of the world is one of the ways in which they think they're being the New Testament church, which they believe solidly they're being the New Testament church. But in being separate, that allows the members of these groups to respond very differently. And indeed, when you've left these groups, you still respond differently to the world. I mean, even, I was for some years an evangelical Christian, and an evangelical Christian from an upbringing where I was brought up in the occult. Yeah, I know, right? And you just sort of, it makes the way you respond to the world and approach the world differently. And there's a value in exploring that. There's a value in looking at that. And I want you to look at the local Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses and realize that that was made by the willing hard work of ordinary people who were prepared to build an entire church building for the sake of their faith. And I think that's really all I want to say. So I'm